July 15, 1982. A body discovered in a cemetery. No name, no identity, no justice. For 40 years, she was known only as Princess Doe, a girl whose face was stolen by violence, whose name was erased by time. Investigators preserved her DNA when technology couldn't yet decode it. Families searched for daughters who never came home. A community refused to let her be forgotten. Then, 4 decades later, science caught up to memory. Genealogical mapping traced fractured bloodlines across generations. A name emerged from silence, Dawn Rita Olenek. And with that name came a reckoning. This is the story of how time nearly erased a girl, and how determination brought her back. From grave to courtroom, from mystery to revelation, this is Princess Doe. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The morning air hung heavy over Blairstown, New Jersey, a quiet town where nothing much ever happened. Raymond Peterek, the cemetery's longtime groundskeeper, began his routine walk through Cedar Ridge just after dawn. Granite headstones stood in patient rows, marking generations of ordinary lives. But that morning, something was wrong. Near the far edge of the cemetery, beneath the shade of oak trees, he saw her, a young woman, collapsed against a grave marker, her face destroyed beyond recognition. Blunt force trauma. No identification, no purse, no clues, just a body left like discarded evidence in a place meant for remembrance. The Warren County Sheriff's Office arrived within the hour. Detective Lieutenant Eric Kranz took command of the scene with quiet authority. He'd worked homicides before, but this felt different. The violence was personal, excessive, the location deliberate. Someone had brought her here to disappear. Kranz knelt beside the body, studying what little remained. She was young, maybe 17 or 18, dark hair, slight build. She wore jeans and a shirt, nothing remarkable. Whoever she was, she'd left home without knowing she'd never return. The medical examiner arrived and confirmed what Kranz already knew. Homicide, death by blunt force. Time of death estimated within the past 48 hours. But without a face, without identification, without witnesses, she was a ghost. Kranz made a decision that would define the next 4 decades. He couldn't let her be just another case number. She deserved dignity. She deserved a name, even if temporary. He called her Princess Doe, not Jane Doe, something that acknowledged she mattered. The investigation began immediately, but the silence was deafening. Dr. Margaret Riley conducted the autopsy with meticulous care. Every injury documented, every detail preserved. The cause of death was clear: massive, blunt force trauma to the head and face. The brutality suggested rage, control, or both. Someone wanted to erase her identity, but Dr. Riley found something else: evidence of sexual assault. This wasn't random violence, it was predatory. The forensic team collected samples with 1980s technology: blood, hair, tissue. DNA testing existed only in experimental labs. They couldn't sequence genetic profiles yet, but Kranz insisted on preservation anyway. He had the samples frozen, cataloged, stored. Maybe someday technology would catch up. The autopsy revealed more. She was approximately 17 years old. 5 feet 4 inches tall, between 110 and 120 pounds. No dental records matched. No fingerprints on file. The body was eventually released for burial, but her identity remained locked in silence. Meanwhile, Kranz examined her clothing for clues. The jeans were common, the shirt generic. No labels provided leads, but something about the way she dressed suggested she wasn't from Blairstown. The town was small, everyone knew everyone. This girl was an outsider. The question wasn't just who killed her, it was who she was, and how she ended up in Cedar Ridge Cemetery. The forensic evidence sat in storage, waiting. The body was buried in the same cemetery where she was found. The community paid for a simple gravestone, marked Princess Doe, and the case went cold. But Kranz never stopped thinking about her. Every year, on July 15, he visited her grave, wondering if he'd failed her by not finding answers fast enough. The investigation consumed Warren County for months. Detectives canvassed Blairstown and surrounding towns. Did anyone see a young woman matching her description? Did anyone hear screams? Did anyone notice suspicious vehicles near the cemetery? The answers were always no. Missing person reports were cross-referenced across New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania. Nothing matched. The FBI entered the case, adding resources and databases. Still, nothing. Kranz worked the case obsessively. He interviewed truck drivers, drifters, anyone passing through the area that week. One witness remembered seeing a young woman at a nearby convenience store buying cigarettes. She seemed nervous. She was alone. But the lead went nowhere. The store had no surveillance cameras. The witness couldn't provide enough detail for a composite sketch given the condition of the body. Forensic artists attempted facial reconstruction, but without a face to reconstruct from, they worked with bone structure alone. The resulting composite was distributed to media outlets. "Have you seen this girl?" Calls poured in, hundreds of them. Each one investigated. Each one a dead end. Parents searching for missing daughters came to Blairstown with photographs and hope. Kranz met with every single one. He compared dental records when available. He listened to stories of runaways and broken families, but none of them matched Princess Doe. The emotional toll weighed heavy. Every false identification meant another family's pain prolonged. By the end of 1982, the case was stalling. Leads evaporated. Public attention shifted, but Kranz refused to close the file. Princess Doe was buried, but her case remained open. The gravestone became a local landmark, a reminder of unsolved injustice. And deep in evidence storage, frozen biological samples waited for technology that didn't yet exist. 9 years after Princess Doe's murder, Arthur Kinlaw sat in a New York prison cell serving time for another murder. He was a career criminal, violent, manipulative, with a history of assaulting women. In 1991, he began writing letters. Some went to investigators, some to journalists, and some mentioned a girl he'd dumped in New Jersey. Warren County detectives received one of those letters. Kinlaw's words were vague but chilling. He'd picked up a young woman in New York. She refused his demands. He killed her and left her body in a cemetery. Could it be Princess Doe? Kranz immediately traveled to the correctional facility to interview Kinlaw face to face. The man was calculating, evasive. He provided just enough detail to seem credible but withheld key facts. He knew about the cemetery. He knew the time frame, but without Princess Doe's identity confirmed, prosecutors couldn't build a case. Kinlaw knew this. He toyed with investigators, alternating between confession and denial. He wanted attention, power over the narrative, but legally, there was nothing to charge him with beyond his existing convictions. The confession became part of the file, but it couldn't move forward without identification. Frustration mounted. Kranz had a suspect who admitted involvement, but no victim to link him to. The law required proof: identity, evidence, connection. Kinlaw's letters were circumstantial, his confession incomplete. The case remained frozen in time. Kinlaw eventually stopped writing. The confession faded into archived files, and Princess Doe remained nameless, her killer unprosecuted. The community continued their vigil, but hope was eroding. Decades were passing, memories fading. The grave remained tended, but the case felt unreachable, until technology changed everything. By 1999, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had established itself as a critical resource for cold cases involving unidentified victims. Princess Doe's case caught their attention. The NCMEC brought modern forensic artistry to the investigation. Using advanced techniques, they created a new facial reconstruction more detailed, more human than anything produced in 1982. The reconstruction depicted a young woman with soft features and dark eyes. She looked like someone's daughter, someone's sister. The image was distributed nationwide through NCMEC's networks and partnerships with media outlets. Television programs featured her story. Websites posted her reconstruction. For a brief moment, Princess Doe returned to public consciousness. Tips flowed in again. Families compared the reconstruction to photographs of missing loved ones. Investigators followed every credible lead. But again, none matched. DNA technology had advanced significantly by 1999, but genealogical databases didn't yet exist. The frozen samples from 1982 remained too degraded for the available sequencing methods. The case stalled again, yet something had shifted. The NCMEC's involvement signaled that Princess Doe wasn't forgotten. Organizations were dedicated to solving cases like hers. Technology was improving. The reconstruction kept her memory alive in a way the original composite never could. Blairstown residents began visiting her grave more frequently. Local schools taught students about her case as a lesson in unsolved justice. The community adopted her as one of their own, protecting her memory, refusing to let time erase her completely. Kranz, now older but still committed, continued his annual visits. He'd preserved the evidence carefully, hoping someday it would matter. That someday was coming. In 2003, a woman named Diane Dye disappeared from California under suspicious circumstances. Her physical description, age, height, build, hair color, matched Princess Doe's profile almost perfectly. Investigators reviewed the case files side by side. The resemblance was striking. Could Princess Doe actually be Diane Dye? The theory gained traction. Media outlets ran stories suggesting the decades-old mystery might finally be solved. Families on both coasts held their breath. DNA testing had improved since 1999. The Warren County Prosecutor's Office authorized comparison testing between the preserved samples from Princess Doe and biological samples from Diane Dye's family. The results came back within weeks. No match. Princess Doe was not Diane Dye. The disappointment was crushing. Public interest, briefly rekindled, faded again. For investigators, it was another dead end in a case defined by them. But the misidentification served one purpose: it proved the integrity of the forensic evidence. The DNA samples from 1982 were still viable. Testing protocols were improving. The science was catching up. Kranz saw the silver lining. Every test refined the methodology. Every advancement brought them closer to the technology needed to solve the case. Meanwhile, online communities dedicated to cold cases began documenting Princess Doe's story. True crime enthusiasts compiled timelines, analyzed evidence, debated theories. The internet kept her case alive in ways traditional media couldn't sustain. Discussion forums like Web Sleuths hosted threads with hundreds of pages analyzing every detail. Armchair detectives shared missing person reports, compared facial features, and kept public pressure on investigators. Princess Doe had become more than a local tragedy. She was a symbol of every unidentified victim waiting for justice. The question wasn't if technology would solve the case, but when. In 2019, forensic science experienced a revolution. Genealogical DNA mapping using genetic markers to trace family lineages through public databases had successfully solved high-profile cold cases like the Golden State Killer. The technology offered hope for cases like Princess Doe's. The Warren County Prosecutor's Office took notice. If degraded DNA could be sequenced and mapped against genealogical databases, they might finally identify Princess Doe after 37 years. The office contacted Astrea Forensics, a company specializing in genetic genealogy for law enforcement. The proposal was ambitious: extract viable DNA from the 1982 samples, sequence the genetic profile, and build a family tree. But there were significant risks. The samples had been frozen for decades. DNA degrades over time, especially biological material from the early 1980s when preservation protocols were less advanced. There was a real possibility the samples wouldn't yield enough data. Astrea's scientists reviewed the case files and decided to attempt extraction. The stakes were high. If they failed, there might not be enough sample remaining for future attempts. If they succeeded, Princess Doe could finally have her name back. The forensic team began the painstaking process of DNA extraction and sequencing. Every step was documented. Every procedure followed strict protocols to maintain chain of custody and scientific validity. Months passed. The work was slow, technical, and fraught with uncertainty. Meanwhile, the Blairstown community prepared for the possibility of answers. Local media covered the developments. Residents who'd tended Princess Doe's grave for decades hoped this was finally the breakthrough. And deep in laboratories, scientists worked late into the night, coaxing genetic information from samples older than many of them. The sequencing was yielding results. Slowly, a profile emerged. The next chapter of Princess Doe's story was about to begin. In 2021, Astrea Forensics achieved what seemed impossible. They successfully sequenced a viable genetic profile from Princess Doe's degraded DNA samples. The profile was incomplete but sufficient for genealogical mapping. The data indicated maternal lineage markers pointing toward Long Island, New York, consistent with the initial theory that she'd come from out of state. Genealogists began constructing family trees using public databases and historical records. They worked backward from genetic matches, identifying distant relatives, mapping connections across generations. The work was meticulous. Each connection required verification, each branch of the family tree carefully documented. By late 2021, the tree was converging on a specific family, the Olenics of Bohemia, Long Island. Records showed a daughter, Dawn Rita Olenek, born in 1964. She would have been 17 in 1982, matching Princess Doe's estimated age. But Dawn's family had never filed a missing person report. There was no record of her disappearance in any database. She had simply vanished without official documentation. Investigators faced a delicate situation. They needed familial DNA to confirm the match, but contacting the family prematurely could cause unnecessary pain if the identification was wrong. The team proceeded carefully. They located living relatives and obtained DNA samples through investigative channels. The comparison testing took weeks. Finally, in early 2022, confirmation came. Princess Doe was Dawn Rita Olenek. After 40 years, she had a name. The NCMEC prepared for public announcement, but first, they needed to notify Dawn's family. Some relatives had suspected she was dead. Others had clung to hope she'd simply disappeared into a new life. The news was devastating and conclusive. Investigators debated timing for the public announcement. They settled on a date that felt cosmically appropriate: July 15, 2022. 40 years to the day from when she was discovered. The arrangements were made, press releases drafted, and for the first time in 4 decades, Princess Doe would be called by her real name, Inside the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, genealogical experts finalized the family tree that identified Dawn Rita Olanek. The maternal line was clear. A direct genetic connection through her mother's side confirmed the identification beyond reasonable doubt. The team cross-referenced birth records, school records, and historical documents from Long Island. Everything aligned. Dawn was born in Bohemia, New York, in 1964. She lived a relatively normal childhood until her teenage years when circumstances became complicated. By 17, she drifted into situations that put her at risk. Details were scarce, but investigators pieced together a portrait of a young woman caught between adolescence and adulthood, vulnerable and unprotected. The decision to delay the public announcement until family notification was deliberate. Dawn's relatives deserved privacy to process the news before it became a media event. NCMEC coordinated with the Warren County Prosecutor's Office to contact the family quietly. Some relatives had never stopped searching, others had made peace with not knowing. Now they would have answers, painful, incomplete, but real. Law enforcement officials prepared for the announcement, understanding it would reignite public interest and reopen questions about her killer. Arthur Kinlaw's 1991 confession would be re-examined under new scrutiny. With identity confirmed, prosecution was finally possible. The pieces were falling into place. The case that had defined generations of investigators was about to reach a turning point. Inside NCMEC headquarters, the mood was somber but determined. They'd given Dawn her name back. Now they'd help deliver justice. July 15, 2022, 40 years to the day. The Warren County Prosecutor's Office held a press conference that would close one mystery and open another. Officials stood before cameras and journalists, announcing what had been impossible for decades. Princess Doe had been identified as Dawn Rita Olanek, 17 years old, from Bohemia, Long Island, New York. The room was silent, except for camera shutters. Investigators detailed the forensic genealogy process that led to identification. Birth records confirmed her identity. DNA confirmed the familial match. After 40 years, she was no longer a nameless victim. The announcement reverberated nationally. Major news outlets picked up the story. Princess Doe had been a mystery for so long that her identification felt monumental. Social media exploded with commentary. True crime communities celebrated the breakthrough, while mourning that it took 4 decades. Dawn's name trended on Twitter. Legacy media revisited the case's history, interviewing retired investigators and Blairstown residents who'd kept her memory alive. But the announcement raised immediate questions. Who killed Dawn Rita Olanek? Why was she in Blairstown? How did she end up at Cedar Ridge Cemetery? Investigators revealed they had a suspect. The 1991 confession from Arthur Kinlaw was being re-evaluated. With Dawn's identity confirmed, prosecutors could now move forward with charges. The case was no longer just a cold case, it was an active murder investigation with a named victim and a suspected killer. Kinlaw was still incarcerated, serving time for other violent crimes. Detectives prepared to confront him again, this time with the power of identification behind them. Dawn's family issued a statement through NCMEC. They thanked investigators for never giving up. They expressed grief for the years lost and the violence that took her, and they asked for privacy as they processed decades of uncertainty finally resolved. The press conference ended, but the story was just beginning. For Dawn, it was resurrection from anonymity. For investigators, it was validation of persistence. For the community, it was bittersweet closure. And for Arthur Kinlaw, it was a reckoning 40 years delayed. With Dawn's identification confirmed, the Warren County Prosecutor's Office reopened every file, every lead, every piece of evidence collected since 1982. Detectives pulled boxes from storage, decades of investigative work now relevant again. Arthur Kinlaw's 1991 letters were re-examined with fresh eyes. His cryptic confession took on new meaning now that the victim had a name. Kinlaw had written about picking up a girl who resisted his demands, about disposing of her body in a cemetery. The details matched Dawn's case, but in 1991, without identification, there was no legal foundation for charges. Now there was. Investigators reviewed Kinlaw's criminal history. He was a predator with a pattern, targeting vulnerable young women, using coercion and violence, moving between New York and New Jersey to evade detection. Dawn fit his victimology perfectly. Detectives cross-referenced timelines. In July 1982, Kinlaw was active in the New York-New Jersey corridor. He had access to vehicles. He had motive and opportunity. The circumstantial evidence was mounting. The challenge was building a prosecutable case 4 decades later. Physical evidence linking Kinlaw directly to Dawn was limited. The 1982 crime scene had been processed with technology that couldn't extract the kind of evidence modern juries expected. But prosecutors had something powerful. Kinlaw's own words. His letters constituted a confession. Combined with the timeline, the identification, and his criminal history, it was enough to file charges. The prosecutor's office prepared charging documents. Murder in the first degree. The announcement would be strategic, timed to maximize impact, and public understanding of how cold cases can achieve justice, even after decades. Public reaction was already intense. Online communities demanded that Kinlaw be charged immediately. Advocacy groups used Dawn's case to call for better resources for cold case investigations. The pressure was mounting. Inside the prosecutor's office, the team worked carefully. They had one chance to get this right. The case had waited 40 years. They would not rush now. Detectives from Warren County traveled to the New York Correctional Facility where Arthur Kinlaw was incarcerated. The interview was conducted under formal advisement. Kinlaw knew he was being questioned about a murder charge. He sat across from detectives with the same manipulative demeanor he'd displayed in 1991, but this time, investigators had leverage. They knew the victim's name. When detectives mentioned Dawn Rita Olanek, Kinlaw's expression flickered just for a moment. He recovered quickly, feigning ignorance. But the detectives pressed. They presented the timeline, the evidence, the genetic identification. They described Dawn's injuries in detail, watching for reactions. Kinlaw provided evasive statements, carefully worded to avoid direct confession, while hinting at knowledge only the killer would have. He mentioned details about Dawn's resistance to prostitution, her travel route from Long Island, the isolation of the cemetery. Each detail corroborated the prosecution's theory, but Kinlaw refused to sign a written confession. He understood the legal implications. Without a signed statement, his words became evidence but not conclusive proof. Detectives recorded the interview, documenting every evasion and admission. The conversation lasted hours. Kinlaw alternated between denial and insinuation, toying with investigators the way he'd done decades earlier. But the power dynamic had shifted. Kinlaw was aging, his control eroding. The detectives had patience and proof. They didn't need him to confess fully his earlier letters, and this interview provided enough corroboration when combined with the forensic evidence. As the interview concluded, detectives informed Kinlaw that formal charges were forthcoming. He would face trial for the murder of Dawn Rita Olanek. Kinlaw showed no remorse, only calculation. He'd spent a lifetime manipulating the system, but this time, the system was ready for him. The interview was submitted to prosecutors as evidence. Legal analysts immediately began dissecting Kinlaw's statements for media outlets. True crime documentarians reached out for interviews. The case was becoming a national story of persistence and justice. And in Blairstown, residents prepared for what they'd wanted for 40 years. Accountability. July 15, 2022. The same day Dawn's identification was announced, the Warren County Prosecutor's Office filed murder charges against Arthur Kinlaw. The timing was deliberate, symbolic. 40 years to the day from her discovery, Dawn Rita Olanek's killer would face justice. The charges were first-degree murder, carrying the weight of decades and the promise of accountability. The indictment detailed the prosecution's case. Kinlaw encountered Dawn in Long Island in July 1982. He coerced her into his vehicle under false pretenses. When she resisted his demands, he killed her with brutal, excessive force. He transported her body to Cedar Ridge Cemetery in Blairstown, a deliberate choice meant to obscure her identity and evade detection. The timeline reconstruction showed Kinlaw's presence in the New York-New Jersey corridor during the critical period. Witnesses from 1982 were re-interviewed. The convenience store clerk who'd seen a young woman buying cigarettes identified the time frame and location as consistent with Dawn's movements. Kinlaw's defense counsel immediately filed procedural motions, including a claim of double jeopardy based on prior investigations. The claim was rejected without identification. No previous charges had been filed. The legal foundation was solid. Prosecutors had confession letters, the recent interview, forensic identification, and circumstantial evidence placing Kinlaw at the scene. It was enough. Public reaction was overwhelming. Headlines declared, "Justice at last for Princess Doe." Social media exploded with support for the prosecution. True crime communities analyzed every detail of the charging documents. Legal experts debated the strength of the case on news programs. But some voices urged caution. 40 years is a long time. Memories fade. Evidence degrades. Winning a conviction would require overcoming defense arguments about the passage of time and the absence of direct physical evidence linking Kinlaw to the crime scene. The case entered the pre-trial phase. Prosecutors and defense attorneys began the complex process of litigating a 4-decade-old murder. Jurisdictional coordination between New York and New Jersey required careful legal maneuvering. The trial date was uncertain, but the charges were filed. For Dawn's family, it was validation. For the Blairstown community, it was vindication. And for Arthur Kinlaw, it was a reckoning he'd evaded for 40 years. Prosecutors brought in modern forensic pathologists to re-examine the 1982 autopsy data. Original photographs, measurements, and injury descriptions were analyzed using contemporary imaging technology and updated methodologies. The findings confirmed the original conclusions. Dawn Rita Olenek died from massive blunt force trauma, but the re-examination revealed additional insights. The pattern of injuries suggested the killer had used an object, possibly a tire iron or similar blunt instrument. The force was excessive, indicating rage or intent to disfigure. Modern analysis confirmed this was not a crime of opportunity. It was deliberate, personal, and sadistic. Forensic psychologists studied the crime scene and autopsy data to develop a behavioral profile of the killer. The profile matched Arthur Kinlaw's known patterns: control-driven violence, targeting vulnerable women, and excessive force to establish dominance. The behavioral analysis would be critical in court, linking Kinlaw's documented history to Dawn's murder. The convenience store witness from 1982 was re-interviewed. She recalled seeing a young woman alone, nervous, purchasing cigarettes. The timing matched Dawn's last known movements. Though she couldn't positively identify Dawn from photographs due to the passage of time, her testimony corroborated the prosecution's timeline. Prosecutors faced a challenge. Without direct physical evidence like DNA or fingerprints linking Kinlaw to Dawn, the case relied on circumstantial evidence, confessions, and behavioral patterns. But circumstantial cases can be powerful when the evidence converges convincingly. The re-examination also addressed defense arguments. If Kinlaw's methods were so distinct, why weren't there other victims with similar injuries? Investigators revealed there were other unsolved murders in the New York-New Jersey area during the early 1980s bore striking similarities. Kinlaw might have been responsible for more than just Dawn's death. Media coverage intensified. Headlines declared, "Science closes 40-year loop." Forensic experts appeared on television, explaining how modern techniques could reanalyze decades-old evidence. The case became a textbook example of cold case investigation. Prosecutors finalized their evidence presentation. The autopsy re-examination provided scientific validation. The behavioral analysis linked Kinlaw to the crime, and the timeline placed him at the scene. The case was strong, but the trial would test whether it was strong enough. In pre-trial hearings, prosecutors presented the forensic genealogy evidence to the court. Experts from Astria Forensics and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children submitted detailed affidavits explaining the identification process. The presentation was technical but compelling. DNA extracted from 1982 samples was sequenced using advanced methods. Genetic markers were uploaded to genealogical databases, identifying distant relatives. Family trees were constructed using public records, historical documents, and DNA matches. The trees converged on the Olenek family. Direct maternal relatives provided comparison samples. The match was definitive. Dawn Rita Olenek's identification was scientifically sound, beyond reasonable doubt. Defense counsel challenged the methodology. They argued the chain of custody for the 1982 samples was questionable by modern standards. They questioned whether the genealogical databases were reliable. They suggested contamination could have compromised the results. Prosecutors countered each argument. The chain of custody was documented meticulously in 1982 and maintained through decades of storage. The genealogical databases used for identification were the same ones that had solved hundreds of cold cases, including high-profile murders, and contamination testing showed the samples were pure. The judge allowed the evidence, setting a precedent for how forensic genealogy would be treated in New Jersey courts. It was a significant legal victory for the prosecution and a validation of the scientific methodology. Legal scholars immediately began analyzing the ruling. Law journals would publish articles examining the admissibility of genealogical DNA evidence in cold cases. The Princess Doe case was shaping forensic law. Media coverage focused on the intersection of technology and justice, how science can solve decades-old mysteries, how persistence pays off, how the forgotten can be remembered. The pre-trial proceedings continued. Defense attorneys filed motions to suppress evidence, to dismiss charges, to delay proceedings. Each motion was litigated carefully. The legal battle was just beginning, but the foundation was set, was legally sound. The evidence against Arthur Kinlaw was admissible. The case was moving toward trial. The identification of Princess Doe and the subsequent charges against Arthur Kinlaw became a national story that transcended true crime. Blairstown residents organized memorial vigils at Cedar Ridge Cemetery. Hundreds attended, bringing flowers, candles, and handwritten notes to Dawn's grave. The community that had protected her memory for 40 years finally knew her name. Dawn's family visited the grave for the first time. It was an emotional pilgrimage traveling from Long Island to a small New Jersey town to stand before the resting place of a daughter, sister, relative lost decades ago. They thanked the community for never forgetting her. They placed photographs on the gravestone, showing Dawn as she was in life, smiling, young, full of potential. Local media covered every development. Regional news stations sent reporters to Blairstown, interviewing residents who'd tended the grave, attended vigils, and kept Dawn's story alive when official investigations stalled. National outlets framed the story as closure, 40 years later, a narrative of justice delayed but not denied. True crime podcasts dedicated episodes to the case. Documentarians approached the Warren County Prosecutor's office, requesting interviews. Legal analysts debated the strength of the prosecution's case on cable news, but some voices expressed skepticism. Could a conviction realistically be achieved after 40 years? Would a jury find circumstantial evidence convincing without direct physical proof? Were the confession letters enough? Defense attorneys appeared on television arguing the case was weak, politically motivated, and legally problematic. The debate raged across media platforms. Online communities were divided. Some celebrated the charges as overdue justice. Others worried the case was being rushed under public pressure. Discussion forums analyzed every piece of evidence, debated legal strategies, and speculated on trial outcomes. For the Blairstown community, the media attention was overwhelming but welcome. Princess Doe was no longer forgotten. Her story mattered, and Dawn Rita Olanek was finally receiving the recognition she deserved. Grave caretakers revealed a touching detail. For decades, anonymous flowers had appeared on Princess Doe's grave. They'd assumed it was a local tradition. Now they understood people who never knew her name still honored her humanity. Legal proceedings continued through late 2022 and into 2023. Prosecutors detailed how Dawn's identification unlocked stalled charges against Arthur Kinlaw. They presented court filings documenting his criminal history across multiple states, emphasizing a pattern of violence against women. New evidence emerged from archived New Jersey records. Kinlaw had been connected to cross-state trafficking operations in the early 1980s. He moved between New York and New Jersey regularly, using highways and back roads to transport women for exploitation. Dawn's resistance to prostitution would have made her a liability and a target. Defense counsel filed for dismissal, citing incarceration jurisdiction issues. Kinlaw was already serving time for other crimes. Could he be tried for a murder committed decades ago? The legal arguments were complex, but the judge ruled against dismissal. New evidence justified new charges, regardless of prior convictions. Public records were updated across databases. Dawn Rita Olanek's name replaced Princess Doe in official documents. Missing person databases were corrected. Death certificates were amended. The bureaucratic recognition of her identity was a quiet but significant form of justice. Media coverage continued, though with less intensity than the initial announcement. Headlines shifted to cold case justice delayed, reflecting frustration over the slow legal process. True crime communities tracked every court filing, analyzing motions and predicting outcomes. The case began trending regionally whenever significant developments occurred. Legal logistics created delays. Coordinating between New York corrections and New Jersey courts required careful scheduling. Kinlaw's defense team requested continuances, a common tactic to extend proceedings and test the prosecution's resolve. But prosecutors were patient. They'd waited 40 years. They could wait longer if necessary. The Blairstown community remained engaged. Local residents attended pre-trial hearings when public seating was available. They wanted Kinlaw to see that Dawn Rita Olanek was not forgotten, not abandoned, not erased. And inside the courtroom, the wheels of justice turned slowly but deliberately toward resolution. Dawn's surviving relatives gave interviews describing decades of uncertainty. Her mother had passed away years earlier without knowing what happened to her daughter. The grief had been compounded by not knowing, was Dawn alive somewhere? Was she suffering? Was she dead? The confirmation brought painful closure, but also revealed systemic failures. Dawn's disappearance in 1982 had never been properly documented. No missing person report existed in NYPD records from that time. How could a 17-year-old girl vanish without official notice? Advocacy groups seized on this failure, calling for reforms in how missing persons cases are handled, especially involving vulnerable youth. The bureaucratic gaps that allowed Dawn to disappear without record were unacceptable. Organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children highlighted Dawn's case as an example of why comprehensive databases and immediate reporting protocols are critical. Public reflection shifted from celebrating the identification to examining what went wrong. How many other young people disappeared in the 1980s without proper documentation? How many families are still searching? How many unidentified remains are waiting for names? Dawn's case became symbolic of broader systemic issues. The conversation expanded beyond true crime into social justice. Why are certain victims remembered while others are forgotten? Why did it take 40 years to identify Dawn? What resources are needed to prevent future cases like hers? Media outlets published investigative pieces examining missing person protocols from the 1980s. They revealed a patchwork system with inconsistent record-keeping, limited technology, and inadequate resources for cross-state coordination. Reforms had improved the system, but gaps remained. Dawn's family expressed gratitude for the investigators who never gave up. They thanked the Blairstown community for honoring her memory, and they called for accountability not just for Arthur Kinlaw, but for the systems that failed Dawn when she needed protection. Public empathy swelled. Dawn was no longer just a cold case, she was a daughter who deserved better. The case transcended forensic science and legal proceedings. It became a moral reckoning about how society values and protects its most vulnerable members. In 2023, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Astria Forensics, and the Warren County Prosecutor's Office presented Dawn's case at national forensic symposiums. The Princess Doe case had become a landmark example of how forensic genealogy could solve decades-old cold cases. The presentations detailed the complete investigative timeline, from the 1982 discovery and evidence preservation through decades of stalled leads and false identifications, to the 2019-2022 breakthrough using genealogical DNA mapping. Each step was analyzed for lessons applicable to other cases. The symposiums emphasized one critical factor: evidence preservation. Lieutenant Eric Kranz's decision, in 1982, to collect and freeze biological samples, despite lacking technology to analyze them, was visionary. That foresight made Dawn's identification possible 40 years later. The message to current investigators was clear: preserve everything. Technology will catch up. Budgetary questions arose. Forensic genealogy is expensive and time-consuming. Could this methodology be scaled nationwide to address thousands of unidentified remains? NCMEC estimated over 100 similar cases could be solved using preserved DNA samples, but funding and resources were limited. Advocacy groups called for increased federal funding. They argued every unidentified victim deserves the same effort that solved Dawn's case. The hashtag Princess Doe Legacy circulated on social media, with calls for legislative action to support cold case investigations. Meanwhile, Arthur Kinlaw remained in custody, unrepentant. His defense team continued legal maneuvering, but the case was moving toward trial. The confession letters documented, the timeline established. The symposium presentations concluded with a sobering reminder: Dawn's case took 40 years to solve. How many others will wait as long? How many will never be solved? The forensic legacy of Princess Doe was both triumph and challenge, proof that justice can reach across decades, and a reminder of how many still wait in silence. Arthur Kinlaw sat in his cell, aging but defiant. He declined most interview requests, maintaining calculated silence, but he continued writing cryptic letters, not confessions, but reflections, denying intent while hinting at knowledge. Forensic linguists analyzed his letters, comparing them to writings from 1991. The linguistic markers were consistent: evasive language, passive voice, carefully constructed denials. The patterns suggested a man who understood legal implications and crafted words accordingly. Defense attorneys hinted at diminished capacity arguments. Kinlaw was older, his mental state potentially compromised by age and incarceration. Could he receive a fair trial? Prosecutors countered with evidence of continued manipulation. His letters demonstrated strategic thinking. His interview responses showed awareness of legal risks. He was calculated, not incapacitated. Public opinion divided. Some viewed Kinlaw as a monster, deserving maximum punishment. Others questioned whether a trial 40 years after the crime served justice or vengeance. Legal scholars weighed in. Proponents argued justice has no expiration date. Victims and families deserve accountability, regardless of time passed. Opponents worried about evidence and memory reliability after such periods. Kinlaw's silence became its own power. By refusing to engage fully, he controlled the narrative somewhat, but his silence also allowed prosecutors to define him through actions and documented history. Without a compelling defense narrative, he was reduced to his crimes. Meanwhile, trial preparations continued. Witness lists finalized, evidence cataloged, legal arguments refined. The case was unprecedented in New Jersey, a 40-year-old murder prosecution based primarily on forensic genealogy and confession letters. The outcome was uncertain, but the process was underway. And in Blairstown, the community prepared for what they hoped would be Dawn Rita Olanik's final chapter. In the fall of 2023, a new headstone was installed at Cedar Ridge Cemetery. The original marker, engraved with Princess Doe, remained. But now, a second inscription was added. Dawn Rita Olanik, 1964-1982. The community gathered for a dedication ceremony. Dawn's family attended, joined by investigators, prosecutors, and residents who'd tended her grave for decades. It was a moment of recognition and remembrance. Speeches were brief, but emotional. The Warren County prosecutor spoke about persistence and justice. NCMEC representatives discussed the importance of never giving up on unidentified victims. Dawn's relatives thanked everyone who'd kept her memory alive, but one detail sparked debate. Should the name Princess Doe remain on the gravestone? Some argued it should be removed now that her real identity was known. The nickname had served its purpose but was no longer necessary. Others felt it should remain as part of her story, a reminder of the years she spent nameless and the community's devotion to her memory. The community voted. The decision was to keep both names Princess Doe and Dawn Rita Olanik, memory and truth side by side. The gravestone would honor her full story, from anonymity to identification. A small capsule containing documentation of the DNA identification process was placed beneath the stone for historical preservation. Future generations would know not just who she was, but how she was found. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence. Attendees placed flowers and notes on the grave. The scene was peaceful, reverent, a stark contrast to the violence that brought Dawn to this place 40 years earlier. Media coverage was respectful. Photographers captured the new headstone, the gathered crowd, the quiet dignity of the moment. News outlets framed it as a story of community and persistence, a reminder that remembrance itself is a form of justice. An annual remembrance was established for July 15, the anniversary of her discovery and identification. Blairstown would gather each year to honor Dawn Rita Olanik, ensuring that future generations would know her name and her story. The grave would never be forgotten again. In early 2024, the Warren County Prosecutor's Office held a ceremony honoring the investigators who worked Dawn's case across 4 decades. Lieutenant Eric Kranz, now retired, received a special commendation for his lifelong dedication. Kranz stood before colleagues and media, visibly moved. He spoke about the weight of unsolved cases, how they stay with investigators long after retirement. Princess Doe had been with him for 40 years. He'd visited her grave every July 15, wondering if he'd failed her by not solving the case sooner. But he'd also done something right, preserving evidence when technology couldn't yet use it. That decision made identification possible. During the ceremony, Kranz revealed personal letters he'd received from Blairstown residents over the years. They'd written to thank him for caring about Princess Doe when others might have filed her away. They'd told him about their visits to her grave, their prayers for her soul, their hope that someday she'd have a name. The letters revealed something profound. The community had adopted Dawn as one of their own. She wasn't just a case number or a Jane Doe. She was their princess, a girl they protected in death the way she deserved protection in life. The ceremony was broadcast statewide, highlighting how dedication and patience can outlast time. It was proof that cold cases matter, that persistence pays off, and that every victim deserves investigators who refuse to give up. Other cold case investigators attended, drawing inspiration from Dawn's story. They asked questions about evidence preservation, genealogical DNA techniques, and how to maintain resolve during decades-long investigations. The ceremony became an educational moment for the next generation of detectives. Awards were presented to the forensic teams who'd identified Dawn. Astria Forensics and NCMEC representatives accepted plaques, recognizing their contributions. But the most powerful moment came when Dawn's family stepped forward, embracing Kranz and thanking him for never forgetting their daughter. The emotional burden Kranz had carried for 40 years lifted slightly. He hadn't failed Dawn. He'd given her voice when she had none. He'd preserved the evidence that would eventually restore her name, and he'd inspired a community to love a girl they'd never met. Justice was still pending, awaiting trial, but recognition had arrived. Investigators gathered for interviews reflecting on how Dawn's case transformed cold case methodology. Forensic genealogy had proven itself viable, but it raised questions about criminal justice's future. The team credited genealogical DNA for solving what traditional methods couldn't. Without it, Dawn might have remained Princess Doe forever. NCMEC estimated over 100 similar cases could be solved using preserved DNA samples and genealogical techniques. Unidentified remains from decades past could finally go home, but the methodology sparked ethical debates. Genealogical databases rely on public participation for ancestry research, not criminal investigations. Was it ethical to use those databases for law enforcement without explicit consent? Privacy advocates raised concerns. Legal scholars, ethicists, and forensic scientists discussed the balance between justice and privacy. Some states moved to regulate genealogical DNA use, others expanded access, prioritizing victim identification. Dawn's case became focal in these debates. Her identification was celebrated, but the methodology raised questions about privacy individuals should surrender for justice. Investigators acknowledged the ethical complexity. They'd used every legal tool to identify Dawn and charge her suspected killer, but they recognized society needed clear guidelines about deploying these powerful technologies. Discussion continued across platforms. Legal experts proposed frameworks. Lawmakers began drafting legislation governing genealogical DNA use in criminal investigations. Through it all, Dawn Rita Olanik's story remained central, a reminder that behind every legal debate was a real person who deserved to be known. Her case changed forensic history and the conversation about how justice and privacy coexist. Twilight settles over Cedar Ridge Cemetery. The headstone gleams in fading light, bearing two names, Princess Doe and Dawn Rita Olanik. Flowers rest at its base, tended by people who never knew her, but will never forget her. Inside a New York correctional facility, Arthur Kinlaw awaits trial. Justice delayed but approaching. Whether conviction comes or not, the case has achieved something profound. Dawn has her name back. The true measure of justice isn't just prosecution, it's recognition. It's the community that refused to let her be forgotten. It's investigators who preserved evidence when technology couldn't yet use it. It's scientists who extracted identity from degraded DNA. It's the family who finally knows where their daughter rests. 40 years erased her face but not her humanity. Time tried to erase her entirely but failed, because people cared, because systems kept working, because Dawn, however delayed, eventually breaks. The camera lingers on her name. Dawn Rita Olanik. Etched in stone, permanent, the girl who changed forensic history, the victim who became a catalyst, the princess who reclaimed her crown of identity. Blairstown's streets are quiet. The cemetery gates will close soon, but her story remains open, echoing across decades. Every name matters. Every victim deserves to be known. Justice, however long delayed, is worth pursuing. Headlines will fade. Media attention will shift. But in this cemetery, Dawn Rita Olanik rests in peace. No longer a mystery, no longer a question mark. She is home, she is known, she is remembered. The case that began with silence ends with her name spoken aloud, restored, permanent, from princess to dawn, from lost to found, from forgotten to eternal. This is her story. This is her justice. This is her resurrection from anonymity into history. And as night falls, one truth remains. Some lights refuse to be extinguished, some voices demand to be heard, and some names, once restored, can never be taken away.